Hi everybody, my name is Joshua Tucker. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to the Jordan Center today on behalf of myself and Alex Cooley. This is part of the New York City Russia Public Policy series that is jointly sponsored by the Jordan Center and the Harriman Institute at Columbia and sponsored generously by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Alex, do you want to say any words?
No, just thank you all for being here. It is just a real pleasure to delve into some waters that we don't normally do as regional studies program, and I think that's exactly the point of this series, to sort of make it contemporary and relevant to like real policy issues. So Josh is a wonderful partner, and just want to thank you again. Really looking forward to this.
Great. So today it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here and all of you who are joining us via live stream to the newest incantation of the series, which is going to be a panel on what do we know about Russia's 2016 Twitter operation during the US presidential election campaign. As many of you know, in a different hat I wear than being director of the Jordan Center, I co-direct the NYU Social Media and Political Participation Lab here at NYU, and we've been working with the data you're going to be hearing about today, and there'll be presentations from people in our lab, but this was sort of like a dream of mine, that I could get other teams from around the country, leverage the synergies between the Jordan Center and the SMAP Lab to get all of these people together in one room. And so it's just a great pleasure for me. I would have been happy with this panel if nobody had showed up and I was the only one in the audience, so it's great to have all of you here in the audience, but this is a real treat for me, and I think you'll find it a real treat as well. What we've done today is we've brought together teams from around the country who have been working since the Twitter released the names of these troll accounts to the US Congress last summer, trying to see what we can learn from this data. And we've been talking amongst ourselves, to ourselves, but this is kind of amazing to get these different research teams all together here for one room and one presentation at the Jordan Center today. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through, we've got four presentations, one by two people, we're going to go through. So we'll have a presentation from each of those people. I've asked everyone to try to keep it to about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to discussion afterwards. In order to kind of keep things going smoothly, let me just quickly introduce everybody right now, and then we'll just go in order that I introduce them. So first up is going to be Cody Bunting, who's a postdoctoral research associate at the SMAP Lab. Next up will be Kate Starbird, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Then we'll have Patrick Warren and Darren Linville. Patrick's an associate professor of economics at Clemson, and Darren is an associate professor of communications at Clemson. And then finally, we'll have Leon Yin, who is a research scientist in the SMAP Lab, who will be our final presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cody, and we'll go through all the presentations, and then we'll bring the panelists all up here together, and then we'll do some larger discussion.
All right, thanks Josh for the introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. Yes, so I'm a postdoc here at the SMAP Lab. My background is computer science. This is a different kind of group than I generally talk to, but I'm really excited to be here and be part of this. So what I'll be talking about today is an empirical study of Russian actors across social media platforms. So we know, based on reports from intelligence agencies, news agencies, and the platforms themselves, there was a Russian information campaign waged on social media platforms through most of the 2015-2016 election cycle, and is potentially still going on now. We know this, but so the questions are, based on the data that we can pull from these platforms and we can observe, can we get some insight into the kinds of strategies or methods that were employed by these foreign actors? So a couple of strategies that we consider may be in this data that we might have expected these foreign actors to deploy are, one is about tipping the scales, either towards a particular preferred candidate, so potentially Donald Trump, or away from a candidate that is actively unwanted, so potentially Hillary Clinton. Or were these foreign actors really trying to just sow distrust and discord and reduce trust in US institutions and political figures? So bring about more sorts of riots like this, or protests like this, or clashes between the population. Now, there's nothing to say that these sets of strategies are mutually exclusive. It's certainly plausible that we have evidence for both of these, and actually I'll talk about at the end that what we see supports both of these kinds of hypothetical strategies. And also, more recently, from the indictment against the 12 GRU agents that came out, one of the things they specifically identified was an effort to sow distrust in the United States and political institutions and attack explicitly the Democratic National Convention. So, given that context, what's really the point? What am I going to be talking about? If you don't remember anything else about my talk, you can remember this, that this talk is about examining the ideology and behavior of known IRA-sponsored accounts across multiple social media platforms to get a sense for aggregate strategy. Now this aggregate strategy is important. We don't really look very deeply in this talk at the content that an individual troll is posting. We're looking at sort of a population level, what are they doing in terms of groups. So how do we do this? How do we actually study these groups? So in terms of data, we have 3 different data sets that we use. One is a data set we collected here at the university in the SMAP lab around US elections. So it was just a collection of tweets that were focused on the US election, mentioning terms like Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, presidential campaign, these kinds of things. And it turns out this collection included content from the 1,052 trolls that Twitter published in their transparency, or in their report to Congress. Also, recently Twitter has released their own IRA data set of all the tweets by these accounts. This is the primary one that we'll use, or that I'll be showing you analysis from. And then in addition, Reddit also released through their transparency report a list of 939 accounts that they've identified as also potentially being part of this Russian information campaign. So that's the data. The next question is, how do we get an insight in sort of ideology? So we have a model that uses political content posted on Twitter from politicians in the United States, created by one of the members of the lab, Greg Eady, who's in the audience. We use this information to build a model that allows us to score domains, news domains, on an ideological scale, going from very negative or very far liberal to very far conservative, and then moderate in the middle. So we'll see an example of that. So we have 3 research questions, or 3 areas of research that I'll talk about. One is on frequency and ideology in Twitter. I see this gets cut off on this slide that I didn't notice. So hopefully that won't be a big problem. So there's frequency and ideology on Twitter. How active were these trolls? When were they active? What kind of information? What was the ideology of stuff they were sharing? Then I'll talk about the difference between Twitter and YouTube, because they share lots of YouTube content. What does this look like? And then we'll finally look at ideology on Reddit for a similar set, this Russian set of accounts here. So first, looking at frequency and ideology, we have this graph. It's a very simple graph looking at this top orange line right here is frequency of a random set of US users on Twitter. So it's just, we have this random collection of US users. We don't really know what they tweet about. This is how often they tweet. This blue line are politically engaged users, users who follow at least 5 politicians. And then this green line is the activity of our IRA foreign actors. And what we can see pretty quickly is, one, there's this spike in activity in June and July of 2015, and then this other spike in activity in September and in October of 2016. Now, what was going on during these times? So in June and July, we had a number of people coming out announcing their candidacy for president, including Donald Trump. Here we don't really know what was going on. We did some analysis looking at the YouTube videos and sort of article titles and article content they were sharing, and there's not a clear theme that emerges about what's being shared here. There is a lot of content about Hillary Clinton being ill during the 9/11 memorial, or about why liberals hate Steve Bannon, these kinds of things, but it's not very clear about what's going on. A potentially more interesting explanation, though as equally as sort of unclear, is that at the beginning of September in 2016, during the G20 summit in China, President Obama had a meeting with Vladimir Putin and essentially said, the United States intelligence agencies know you're targeting election infrastructure in the United States. Stop. After this meeting, we saw a significant drop-off in attacks of election infrastructure, but maybe this was an artifact of a shift in strategy away from attacking infrastructure and towards information operations. We don't know. This is a plausible explanation, but we don't know. So this is about activity. The next question is, we can look at overall ideology. So this is just of all the links that were published during that day, or aggregated at the month level here. What was the average ideology score for that particular time period? So here, very negative values. This values down here, this would be more liberal. Values up here are more conservative. And what we see is, during these 2 spikes of activity, we see a spike or a push towards conservative content, an increase in sharing of conservative content. But during the rest of the time, really the trolls, I was surprised by this, sort of vacillate between center-left and center-right in the kinds of content that they share. Except for here, in the summer of 2016, where then they actually become more liberal than the general politically engaged and random users on Twitter. Now, we'll start to break this down, sort of figure out what's going on. This top graph is the overall frequency, the activity of these of news shares aggregated at the monthly level. And the first thing that we see, so these are random US users, politically engaged US users, and our IRA trolls. Our trolls are sharing about the same kind of volume as our politically engaged users. So they're really, in terms of news sites, so they're really focused on this topic of politics, though it's not entirely clear which subtopic is of interest. Now this is the same ideology graph that I showed you before, just split across 3 different levels. And to get a sense of what they're sharing, the kinds of content they're sharing, we broke down the kinds of content, the news media they're sharing, into moderate, conservative, and liberal. Basically, we have this unidimensional scoring method. Anything that has a lower score of Washington Post is going to be liberal. Anything that has a higher score of the Wall Street Journal is conservative, and anything in between is moderate. This is relatively arbitrary. We know that Wall Street Journal is one of the only news sources that is trusted by both sides, or marginally trusted by both sides. So yeah, this is mostly arbitrary, but it gives some insight in that here, if we look across the different populations, our random users and our politically engaged users are pretty consistent. They share a little bit of conservative content, and then mostly a mix of liberal and moderate content. But when we look at our trolls, we get a very different picture. They're oscillating back and forth, sharing different kinds of content. During their highest periods of activity, it's very conservative. Other times it gets pretty liberal. So the question is, what's going on here? Are we seeing accounts that sort of, on today they're posting lots of liberal stuff, and tomorrow they're posting a lot of moderate or a lot of conservative stuff? Or are we seeing a more activation strategy, where today the liberal accounts are active, and then tomorrow the liberal accounts quiet down and the conservative accounts become active? So to start breaking down this sort of troll level ideology, we can take the mean of all the links that you share and figure out what your ideology is. Basically, if you share mostly New York Times stuff, you're going to be more left. If you're sharing mostly Fox News stuff, you're going to be more right. And what we see, again, surprisingly, there's a huge number of moderate and liberal trolls relative to the relatively small number of conservative trolls. But if we look at their overall activity, conservative trolls are significantly more active. They're sharing more content than their liberal counterparts, but over time, the trolls are actually relatively consistent in the kinds of content they share. We don't see huge spikes where, today they're sharing a very different ideology than what they were sharing yesterday. So this kind of supports the idea that what's going on here is sort of an activation strategy. That it's on particular days, one group, this division of labor works out where one group of liberal trolls post, and then the next day, this group of conservative trolls post. Although it breaks out in a little bit larger timeline than that. And then also, when we look at this compared to what their trends are, we see at the beginning when the trolls were first becoming active, they were pretty close to each other in terms of ideology. They weren't very different. But over time, they've become much more extreme from each other, and they get much closer to what the general population is sharing and get a little past what the population is sharing. So potentially here, this is trying to pull apart the population. So that's on frequency and ideology on content that was shared within Twitter. Now we can look at content that was shared on or about YouTube. Now you first may ask, why do we care about YouTube? Well, one is that YouTube is one of the most commonly used media sharing platforms on the planet, and two, it's the second most commonly linked to domain on Twitter, and actually the most common domain outside of Twitter. Now, based on some preliminary work, we can expand the method or extend the method for scoring political ideology for news organizations to YouTube. This is 430 channels that are shared by our sample of random political and troll users. And we see it's kind of bimodal. There's a huge amount of moderate content on Reddit, or excuse me, on YouTube, and there's a peak over here of conservative content on YouTube as well. So most of this content is like music channels. So if we look at this and we compare the kinds of news that a troll shares versus the kinds of YouTube channels that a troll shares, we start to see an interesting pattern where conservative trolls share way more YouTube content than liberal trolls. And we see a difference in behavior where if you're a liberal troll over here, you're still going to be sharing conservative YouTube content. Maybe not a whole lot, but you're still sharing some. Whereas if you're a conservative troll on Twitter, you're basically sharing no liberal content on YouTube at all. So again, why is this? Not entirely sure, but this is a nice sort of finding here. Now, moving on to comparing what we've seen on Twitter and Twitter shares of YouTube, we can look on Reddit. Again, the same kind of graphs we've seen before. This is a random Reddit population, politically engaged Reddit, and our troll Reddit group. This is their activity, their overall ideology, and then the breakdown that we saw before. And what we see here is that our troll population spikes in terms of activity during the summer of 2016. Before that, they're not very active. And then after that, they are essentially non-existent. They don't really share anything. But during this time, they're primarily liberal. Okay. They're primarily liberal, but then during the summer of 2016, we see an uptick in conservative content. So there's some difference here in the kinds of content that's being shared on Reddit. It's primarily more liberal, but then it jumps. We see this same kind of increase in conservative sharing that we see, or rather, we see a flip of what we see on Twitter. Where on Twitter during this time, we see more liberal content coming from trolls. Here we see an increase in conservative content, the liberal content still dominates. And then a useful note here is actually Reddit is becoming significantly more conservative over time in a way that Twitter is not. So going back to the hypothetical strategies that we may see, what we actually see here is support for kind of both of these strategies. On the one side, so this is preferring one candidate over the other, we see a number of different sort of supports for this, like conservative accounts tend to be louder. We see a spike in conservative content around Trump's candidacy announcement. We see a spike in conservative content before the election. YouTube content is primarily conservative. So this would suggest maybe there's a preference for one candidate over the other. But on the other side, there are observations that aren't consistent with that. So we have more moderates and liberals than there are conservatives. We have consistent ideology within troll accounts. So if most of our trolls are sharing, ideologically consistent things, then this maybe is some very subtle pre-propaganda strategy where I'm primarily liberal and on very seldom occasions I drop some piece of conservative content. It's unclear. But also we see this overall ideological vacillation where at points they're becoming conservative and they become more liberal as a whole population. So it's unclear. We see this rather multifaceted kind of strategy that is supported on both sides. So again, just to remind, the idea is, for this we were looking at ideology and behavior for known IRA-sponsored accounts across multiple platforms, 3 different platforms here, to get some sense of this multifaceted strategy. What do we see? What behaviors do we see that support which kind of strategies here? All right? Thank you very much, and I guess we'll do questions.
Thanks, Cody. Pass over to Kate.
All right. I'm going to complicate this a little bit. All right, we are getting a little cut off the screen, but hopefully that'll work. All right. So, is there a way to knock down the front light?
Yeah.
Will that be
Jump up there.
Huh? Excellent.
That's okay.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It'll be prettier with the slides. I got some visualization. All right. So, let me make sure I have the right button. All right. So, Kate Starbird, University of Washington. At my lab, actually before I got to University of Washington, I was at the University of Colorado. And since 2009, for about 10 years now, we've been studying Twitter. We've been studying mostly use of Twitter during crisis events. That evolved over time to look at misinformation during crisis events, eventually disinformation during crisis events, and also political organizing of different kinds. So we've been in adjacent spaces for a long time, really looking at Twitter data. And one of the things that we do a little bit differently than Cody is we use both quantitative and qualitative methods, which means we read a lot of tweets, we make a lot of visualizations, I'll show you them, but we've read hundreds of thousands, probably even more at this point, and we've coded 100,000 tweets by hand and read a lot more and looked at users. So we really get inside the data. And so I want to show you a little bit of what we learned. And I want to talk to you how we kind of got into this IRA data set, because it was not on purpose, it was absolutely by accident. So it started with a student of mine, actually undergraduate student, Leo Stewart. We were working on something else, and he came to me and told me, I really care about this. I want to study the Black Lives Matter movement. And I said, sure, as a side project, and I assigned a PhD student, Emma Arif, to this project, and the two of them went off and kind of worked on it and came back with some really interesting findings. So what they started looking at was the Black Lives Matter conversation on Twitter related to shooting events in 2016. It's a data set we had. We were collecting on crisis events, so we had a lot of this kind of data. And I want to point out before I get any further that Black Lives Matter is an organic movement in the United States. They're protesting police violence and police violence against African Americans and other kinds of systemic racism. And I want to make sure that that point is known as an organic movement. It also had it also became a site for political, sort of political partisan discourse, and people on the right started shouting at people on the left, and eventually a site for information operations. Initially, we didn't know about that last part. What we did know is that it was a very polarized conversation. So I'm going to explain this graph a little bit. So this is from a data set of several million tweets. I don't have the numbers on top of my head, but each of these nodes is an account. And the accounts are clustered by by other accounts that retweeted each other. So two nodes are closer to each other if they retweeted each other and further apart if they didn't. And what this graph shows, first thing, you push the button, out it comes, is that we have a very two-sided conversation in Black Lives Matter in 2016. That's probably not surprising. On one side, on the politically left accounts, turns out, I flipped the graph that way so it would be easy. We had sort of pro-Black Lives Matter accounts that also had a sort of, they were politically left, either pro-Bernie, pro-Hillary, just supportive of sort of left-leaning causes. And on the right is this sort of counter-movement that's very anti-Black Lives Matter. It's very politically right. They use hashtags like Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, and they essentially start yelling at each other. So we write this paper about framing contests about these two sides. We actually use a lot of example tweets of what became in some ways a very divisive conversation. And we published in 2017 in November. That same month, Twitter and the U.S. Congressional Intelligence Committee released that first list that they gave us of the IRA accounts. I'm like strolling through Twitter, I'm like, oh, look at a list of accounts. And I was like, oh, we recognize those. I was like, oh, I know that account. So I said, hey, Leo, take this set of accounts that we have and go run it against this graph that we already have so we can see where they are. And then Leo did that, he sent it to me, and I said, no, that doesn't look right. Go send it to me again. And he goes, nope, that's what it is. So what we found was, and accidentally, was that these IRA accounts were embedded in both sides of the graph. Some of us, of course, you expected them to be on the other side, but really they were on both sides. And in some cases, they were, so on the politically left, in some cases they're just kind of normal Black Lives Matter accounts, trying to talk about the cause. In other cases, they're kind of typical for internet culture, trying to stoke outrage, get people to up in arms about perceived injustice or actual injustice in many cases. And in other cases, they became some of the most vitriolic accounts that we saw, and sort of not quite advocating violence against cops, but close. And then on the other side, the politically right, we saw this very different framing of Black Lives Matter. Starting to say Black Lives Matter was advocating for violence against cops, and just sort of other kinds of inflammatory content. So in this case, we can see that these accounts, these IRA accounts in this case, which are the orange, were modeling the behavior of other accounts we saw in the space. And also, if you kind of take a look, we can't say much about this because these graphs aren't always perfect representations, but we can almost see them on the outsides of each of these groups, kind of pulling them apart. So they are enacting caricatures of U.S. citizens, and I'll show you a little bit about that in the future. But they're enacting these caricatures, and they were also sometimes enacting worse than the worst on the other side, and you can see them kind of doing that. So after we found that graph and kind of looked at those accounts, one of my students went in and did sort of in-depth qualitative analysis of what was going on. So he took all those account names and he traced them across different platforms and found these like very complex personas that the IRA accounts were sort of enacting on both sides of this conversation. On the left, you can see sorry, I'm trying to read my notes. It's my first time actually giving this content. You can see that they're playing on stereotypes of African Americans. On the right, you can see that they're playing on stereotypes of white conservative Americans, and they were actually sort of enacting these very rich personas and sort of cultivating audiences around these very rich personas, and they weren't unidimensional. And one thing I will say very particularly about these ones, and you'll see it a little bit more as we go on, is it wasn't just right or left. A very particular kind of pro-gun, Southern American, white conservative, nationalist, anti-immigrant, and very particularly Black Lives Matter kind of content. Of course, we entered that through the Black Lives Matter conversation. So we actually didn't know, we were very opportunistically, so the data set we had, that used to be that's all we got with Twitter, but then they released the rest of the data. And we could see, now where does this data we saw, this little campaign we saw of Black Lives Matter, fit into the larger larger information operations that the Internet Research Agency was running? And actually, this is really interesting. It turns out that Black Lives Matter was, if you look, oh, wait a minute, let me back up, let me tell you what this graph is. So this graph actually is taking all the popular hashtags that were in the set, all the hashtags, and each node is a hashtag that appeared in the set, and it's sized by the number of times it appeared in that set. So the bigger they are, MAGA, 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 right? The bigger they are, the bigger they're going to appear in the node. And they're attached if the two hashtags appeared in the same tweet together, because sometimes people add a lot of hashtags. So it's actually a co-occurrence graph of hashtags. And you get a sense of the different kinds of hashtags that were used and used together. And this way we can kind of group the hashtags together. And here we actually can see Black Lives Matter is a pretty large part of this campaign. And then other large part is sort of this right-leaning US conservative. So we actually stumbled in on our graph to a large part of their operations. They also have some sort of newsy accounts that I won't talk a lot about, but maybe someone else will. And there's some other sort of internationally focused accounts there. These are all, for the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about only the English-speaking, or the English language tweets, because we don't have Russian language speakers on our team and weren't able to analyze the Russian language speeches. The Russian language tweets. All right, so we have this graph to kind of get a sense. So the next thing we did is I wanted to understand, this is actually the most recent stuff, I wanted to understand how the different accounts group together. The accounts are what's interesting, and I did a different kind of representation, hopefully we'll get there, for this, and I think this is, you all build off, the next talk is going to build off this a little bit as well. So in this case what we did is I was trying to figure out how the different accounts interacted over time, and actually I thrashed with this data set a long time to figure out exactly how to do it. And I thought that this might be an interesting way to start. I took in-network retweets. So when an IRA account retweeted another IRA account, I put them in a network graph. And in this case, a different kind of network graph. Each account is a user, an IRA account user, and they are clustered together if they retweeted each other. That grows stronger if they retweeted each other more times, they get closer together. If they didn't retweet each other or they didn't retweet a lot, they get further apart. And we actually see some really interesting clusters of the different kinds of accounts. In one side, very far away, are what I call proto-trolls. These are trolls that never became anything. They were trolls that tweeted a few times, kind of sometimes retweeted each other, but never were activated for anything that we could tell. And a lot of them either went away or these ones went away. They just never did anything. But then over here is a cluster of accounts that were really active in 2016. Some of them continue to be active, but this is kind of the heart of their 2016 campaign. And from here, what we did is I added, there's an algorithm that helps color accounts by when they have common edges. And so this is an algorithmic push the button, and it kind of finds what it calls communities. And from these communities, we can infer some other kinds of different kinds of accounts. And these communities actually have 4 different kinds of accounts. I think these kind of align with what you did using another method, so I think that's going to be really interesting. We have that Black community. And again, these aren't just typical left-leaning. These are very specifically Black community, African-American community accounts in the ways that they were trying to present themselves. And then we have this kind of US right, the one that I showed you before, very consistent. The accounts that we found in our early research, that was kind of representative of what they were trying to do. They also have these newsy accounts that I mentioned before, and again, they served an interesting purpose, and they actually got sometimes retweeted by people, by their trolls on the right and the left, and that kind of held the cluster together. But they serve some other interesting purposes as well. And then these things I call hashtag warriors. I'll let you all kind of try to explain what they do. Again, they hold the cluster together. They didn't do anything. They're politically active, sort of right-leaning. They try to get people to be they try to get hashtags to trend and get people to be polarized, but it's not necessarily that interesting. It is interesting. It's just not what I'm going to focus on here because I'm going to tie it back in. So if I look into the accounts that were active, it's actually, there's not that many accounts in these different clusters. When I show you something that's interesting later, they actually account for a large percentage of the overall tweets. These little polarized accounts, small number, but a huge portion of the overall all the tweets for the set. As you can see, we've got these different hashtags. Again, Black community. These liberal accounts. This is all identified with the African American community. And then on the right side, we've got terms. These are the popular hashtags in their popular. It's not just hashtags, but terms in their profile descriptions. Conservative, TCOT. It's top conservatives on Twitter. It's like a hashtag that helps organize grassroots activism, conservative activism. Wake Up America, which was popular with the IRA accounts, but I don't otherwise see it in U.S. conservative stuff. Christian, PJNet, another sort of grassroots, U.S. grassroots thing that actually, it's a grassroots effort to organize conservatives that's not always grassroots, but it's homegrown. And the IRA accounts began to piggyback on it and use it and become part of that effort as well. I want to get into the last thing I want to show you is sort of the timelines. Cody mentioned the timelines. I can add a little more insight to that, but there's still some open questions on the timelines. But the timelines, when we look at the different clusters, is interesting. So this is a timeline of the IRA English tweets over time, tweets per day. I'm going to go at a higher level. I think tweets per month is a little bit too much to see what's really going on. You really want to see it per day because you can see some interesting trends. So this is their timeline over the course of from 2014 on. Before 2014, there's not much happening. Here's the timeline when we overlap just those clusters of accounts that I was talking about, the Black community and the U.S. right, the ones that I saw before. You can actually see something interesting here. Their timelines are very similar. What you can't see here, the blue is right under the red. The blue and red are almost mirror images of each other. Sometimes they're on different days that they peak, but they peak at about the same time, and they have sort of the same consistency over time, and they show up at about the same time in early 2015. There's some interesting periods here. Cody mentioned them. I'm going to go 1 minute over. I hope you'll forgive me. There's some interesting periods here. Cody mentioned this one. It's sort of I call them onboarding, where their account switched to this mass tweeting behavior that I think had something to do with kind of getting themselves attention and like just developing an identity, They all tweeted the same things, whether they were on the left, right, or something else. So that was happening here. They do another kind of onboarding thing here, and that's not just the right and left accounts, that's everyone. But after that, they start establishing their personas. Before this, they're all these sort of proto-trolls. They all kind of look alike. And after that, they start really establishing who they were. So this happens right this is like the summer of 2015 is when they change their strategy. Their trolls evolve very quickly and become much more sophisticated. And this actually corresponds to something even more interesting. And let me put this on here. So what I showed you was the tweets from the IRA accounts. Now I'm going to show you how many retweets they got overall. Early on, they're tweeting and nobody's retweeting them. No retweet count. All of a sudden, right before, I think it starts in December 2015, it goes like this. And it goes like this, and these, the blue are retweets of the Black Lives Matter or the Black community, red are retweets of the US right. Almost all the retweets they get are from their politically polarized accounts, those 300 and some total accounts. All right, it's not even 300, I think. And that constitutes almost all of their attention. So this is when they start to work. This is when their strategy finally starts to make traction. And actually, it ends up constituting 85% of their overall retweets come from these two tiny communities of accounts. The last thing I want to say I'm not really going to have time to say it, but we can talk about whether it was about polarization. Cody mentioned that. But we also can see that there were times that they came together to share common things. So there's cultivating audiences, growing audiences, and then there's targeting with specific kinds of messages. And on the left, they denigrated Hillary. On the right, they denigrated Hillary and advocated for Trump. So they're actually converging around one kind of strategic message, but they were targeting two populations in different ways. My takeaways are that this campaign had multiple dimensions that evolved over time. In early 2015, their strategy targeting U.S. political right and the U.S. Black community matured rapidly. In December 2015, they began to gain traction in terms of retweets, and we can assume followers as well. We don't have that data, you all might. This strategy was integrating into politically active communities, cultivating audiences, and targeting those audiences with strategic messaging, both pro-Trump and anti-Hillary, probably some other messaging as well. And this sowing discord stuff we've talked about, I'm not sure whether that's an objective or a tactic or both, but it's certainly not the whole goal. There's other things going on there. All right, thank you, and sorry for going over.
Thanks so much. All right, we're going to switch machines really quickly, and we're going to turn it over to the Clemson team. Who's going to go next? That's that goes down. Yeah.
Oh, this one.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, we stole our board.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great.
So I'm Patrick Warren from Clemson. I'm going to get us started here. I really like everything that Kate had to say because it's going to lead really naturally into what we're going to be talking about today, which is basically the heterogeneity of account types. That's clearly the theme that everybody's hitting here, and it's super important to try to understand what's going on. But there's one dimension of heterogeneity that we haven't been talking much about and that I want to mention, and that is this. So we've been breaking the English language tweets into different types, but I think it's really important to notice that there were more non-English tweets than there were English tweets in this data set that Twitter released. And so if you look over time, all the way back to like the first tweets in this data set are actually from 2011 basically, we have non-English tweets, millions of non-English tweets, mostly Russian, but not exclusively Russian, early on. And so I want to make a pitch to the audience here. Just like Kate, I can't analyze these. I don't have the institutional knowledge, I don't have the language background to do a good job, but we really need to understand these tweets too, and I hope somebody in this room will help to do that. Because the IRA was all about Russian language content way before they got involved in English language content. Okay, so heads up, I'm happy to talk with folks about doing that. But that's the first dimension of heterogeneity I think gets glossed over a lot, but I think it's really important. Now, I want to introduce my colleague Darren Linville, and the reason I want to do that is because he's going to talk about how we ended up categorizing these groups, and it wasn't a machine learning approach at all. It was poor Darren reading 3 million tweets. So let me introduce Darren, and he'll tell you how we categorize.
That was several months of my life I'll never get back. But it was all for a good cause. And to Patrick's point about these about the non-English tweets, I think another thing that often gets glossed over is the number of different languages. German, French, a whole bunch of them in Italian. I've spoken to so many journalists from Italy. For something I was in Italian. We were in Italian Rolling Stone, something I never thought would happen. And a lot of that has happened, especially after 2016, when the IRA has gotten more funding and more resources. They've expanded. So we broke them into very similar categories to what Kate did, just in a very different way. Our 5 categories we call fearmonger, left troll, right troll, hashtag gamer, and newsfeed. Newsfeed obviously being self-explanatory. This is a real quick word cloud representing the fearmonger category. Now, I think Kate called this same time period proto-trolls. This is what they were doing in 2014 and 15, and they would hype a false event in the real world, mostly in the US, but in the Ukraine as well. And they would just try to create an event that never happened. This included a salmonella scare in upstate New York. a chemical explosion in Louisiana, for various reasons. But you'll also see a few other things in here, much smaller. Obviously, the size of the word is how often it appears. But you'll see things like rap. This is just a word cloud, not of the words used, but of the hashtags used, just to clarify. So you'll see little things like rap and rap again. So most of what these of the content for these proto-trolls, these fear-mongers, was just very bot-like. And it was almost exclusively song lyrics. It took me a while to figure that out, because it would be some random song lyrics, especially country music. Russians love their country music. And the occasional line of poetry. And then they would tag on these just random hashtags like hashtag rap. Because, you know, that's what them American kids love. They like the rap. But then periodically they would stop, and they would stop their bot-like activity. You could see an actual human come in and start talking about a fake event that wasn't an actual thing. This happened throughout 2014, 2015. As Patrick suggested, our categories were pretty homogeneous. This was the one category, and as Kate suggested, that you saw some of them develop into other trolls, especially a number of them developed into right trolls, right-leaning trolls. But for the most part, a lot of them got shut down, because if you're the only account in the world tweeting about you know, another Fukushima disaster in the Ukraine that didn't actually happen, or an or Coke Farms, that Coke Farms is a turkey distributor that supposedly sold to Walmart and then sold turkeys in upstate New York that gave everybody salmonella. And if you're the only person tweeting about that thing that never happened, that's a good way to indicate to Twitter that you should probably get shut down. So a lot of those accounts didn't exist very long. They would tweet about their thing, and then they would disappear. The newsfeed category is fairly self-explanatory. They were just news feeds from various locales across the United States. There were a couple in New York. Wherever you're from, your city probably had one of these, tweeting about local news. There were about 40 of them or so. There were a few that we put into this category that tweeted about international news, Syria Today, a couple other similar categories. I think you could see that in Kate's word cloud as well. But they just kind of chugged along and tweeted about local news, usually mostly pulling from actual other news feeds in a very bot-like fashion. Then this is my favorite category. Kate called these the hashtag warriors, which I think has a little more of a nice Cold War aesthetic than hashtag gamers, which is what we went with. But the hashtag gamers, so I was very confused by this when I first saw it, and it took reading many thousands of them before I really written and figured it out. But there are these things called hashtag games. Comedy Central runs them, and the Russians ran a number of them. Some of those big accounts that you saw on Kate's graph, like Giselle Evans, that was an account that the Russians used to run hashtag games. So what they would do is, at a particular moment, they would say, hey, I'm going to have a hashtag game at 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, led by Giselle Evans. And then people would get together at that time on Twitter, and you would take a hashtag like things you can't ignore and must be banned and to-do list before Christmas, and you would just riff on it. You and I might riff on that in, you know, to do before Christmas, you know, buy, you know, presents for my kids, only I'd make it actually funny. Whereas they would occasionally do that, just something innocuous and funny, but then they would also often get divisive, racist, but they particularly liked to attack institutions with these account types, especially the electoral process. Surprise. Then I'm not going to talk much about these. These have been well covered. You had BLM accounts. You had right-wing accounts. This represents the hashtags that the Black Lives Matter accounts were using. It wasn't exclusively Black Lives Matter accounts that we we put in this category. There were, but it was almost exclusively related to identity politics. There were a couple of pro-Islamic accounts and a Native American account and a couple other outliers, but mostly Black Lives Matter. And then the right-wing accounts had some diversity in there as well. There was a couple of Texas secessionist accounts. I mean, they got really creative. There was one jihadist second wife that was a parody account. It said it was a parody account. It pretended to be the second wife of an ISIS jihadist. They tried to be darkly funny sometime and succeeded occasionally, not with that account. But mostly it was just run-of-the-mill MAGA Americans like Pamela Moore 13. They had one account that purported to be the official account of the Tennessee GOP that had tens of thousands of followers. But most of them were just normal, like Jenna Abrams. Jenna Abrams, retweeted by Donald Trump. That was a Russian. And I'm going to hand it back to Patrick.
All right, so we've seen a lot of graphs like this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. I want to point out, so these are the first three account types that Darren talked about. These are the fear mongers, which are in yellow, and as you can see, they were like, if you can see in yellow, they were super active very early on. They sort of gave up on using that sort of approach. There's a little bit here in the middle. The hashtag gamers were really big coming into election season. Like we said, there was a lot of sort of anti-electoral, like before the debate, there would be rejected debate topics that would get pretty nasty. The news feeds were very bot-like. Like I said, very consistent, same level all the time, non-stop, every day, every day, every day. Some of them got shut down. Here, they still pop back up. Okay. Right trolls and left trolls. Same graph you saw before, right? Big jump and right. I see. Obviously, we have some categorical differences here because we have big differences in activity levels between right and left trolls in 2015. Big spike on October 6th, the day before WikiLeaks released John Podesta's emails. We can think about why you might have a big spike in left troll activity in particular. The day before that, we have some ideas. We can't prove anything, but that's what that spike is. That was October 6th. And then I want to zoom in quickly. So this is right around September 11th through September 21st. And these are zooming in at the hourly level. Now what I want you to take away from this is this idea of effort allocation. So even within, say, a few hour period, what would you get? You would get a couple hours where they were concentrating on right troll output. So people were working on right troll. And then it was like a bell rang. And you switched. That's enough right trolls for now. Let's do hashtag gaming now. And so they would do that for an hour or so. And then, it would be time to switch back and forth. But then there would also be events that would trigger things. So actually, the Seaside Park bomb went off on September 17th about 1:30. They had already started a big right troll activity, not because they knew this was going to happen. Another event happened that we talked about already, which was Hillary Clinton stumbles, and then Hillary Clinton returns to the campaign trail, and then there were lots and lots of right troll tweets about Hillary Clinton's health. That's what was happening here. And then when the bomb goes off, I would have expected this to end, kind of like it was, they were working kind of in shifts. I would have expected this to end, but what happened is that they had transitioned over to the Seaside Park bombing when that went off.
Overtime.
Sorry? Over here.
They made overtime.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly right. And so when you zoom in, you can really sort of see this effort allocation going on. There's one other thing I want to talk about. Oh my goodness, it's not going to work as the zoom.
Say in brother, can you say how much, so when you get to 600 what, per hour or 600?
Sorry, here,
Okay.
this is tweets per hour.
Oh.
That's right.
Are those
Can we-
original tweets or retweets?
This is total output, so it's retweets and original tweets. Can we see? I guess we can see everything we need to see here. So here are the 5 types: news feeds, left trolls, fear mongers, right trolls, and hashtag gamers. And this is the fraction of your tweets, which are retweets, this question was just raised, that are retweets of other troll accounts. So there are lots of external retweets going on here, like I retweet Donald Trump, or I retweet NBC News, or whatever. That's the sorts of retweets that you were, or links that you were analyzing. But here we're looking at internal retweets. And what I want to point out is that there's quite a bit of homophily, I guess. Right trolls retweet other right trolls a lot. That's kind of how you group them together, or one way that you group them together. But they don't really retweet left trolls hardly at all, or fear mongers. Same thing with hashtag gamers. They retweet themselves a lot. They retweet right trolls a little bit because they're often trying to do divisive right-wing content. But the fact I want to point out is this. News feeds hardly retweet anybody, but these right trolls and left trolls were retweeting their own news feeds a lot. And so that raises a question of like, what were they trying, like, these news feeds were just replicating content from legitimate news services. So why were the right trolls retweeting the news feeds? I think it was to make them look more legitimate. I can't think of another reason to do that. So the right trolls and the left trolls are retweeting these fake news feeds in order to make them look more legitimate. Which leaves, of course, the question of like, what were they trying to do with these news feeds? Okay, and we have some ideas about that we could talk about later on. That's what I have.
All right, Leon? You take grab that.
Hello. Should I start?
Yeah, I just want to make sure, click the button, just to make sure it works. Yeah, okay, great.
Great. Hi, my name's Leon Yin. I'm a research scientist at the SMAP Lab. I work with Josh. I'm also an affiliate at Data and Society. I see a lot of familiar faces here. Hello and hello Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the Internet Research Agency sharing news articles and how they did so. And if you're following online, you can click this bit link. It's bit.ly/smap_IRA_links. And we'll actually be talking about bit.ly too, so stay tuned. So what is this talk about? This talk is about how we studied hyperlinks shared by the IRA, and it's also about the tools and pipelines employed by the IRA. So one is a specific content analysis of this campaign, and another is what are the general tools that can be used for such campaigns, and how can we generalize this? So I actually have two goals here. One is to convince you that fake news is not the only bad kind of information, and that context can be very important, especially with truthful news. Secondly, I want to convince you that the IRA looks more like a marketing agency than a group of hackers. In fact, they use a lot of free marketing tools to automate activity on Twitter. So we analyzed links, and this is the pipeline we employed. We used the Twitter IRA dump that everyone else here has been using as well, except we extracted only URLs. And so about half of them are shortened through bit.ly alone, right? And so you can't analyze something remarkable when it's just bit.ly. So bit.ly is an amazing tool that I use myself. I'm not getting paid to promote them, but they shorten links to a small brandable thing. They also give you analytics for clicks, right? But however, if you're a researcher, such as us, you can't analyze what it is because it's hidden behind bit.ly. So we had to create custom software to expand it. And it's available in open source. It's called URL Expander. So if you're into Python, check it out. So we would expand it in all the shortened bit links to get some sort of article, like this NPR one, and then we'd extract the domain. And so our unit of analysis is looking at domains shared by IRA accounts. Specifically, we look at non-Cyrillic accounts in the 2016 cycle, and our resulting data set of links is about 200,000 from about 550 users. For a sanity check, we created two comparison groups. One are political users, people who have tweeted at least twice at either or about Trump or Hillary during the same time period, as well as a random user group from a random number generator. So we collected their tweets and then processed them the exact same way and got the same units of analysis looking at domains. So what kind of news domains do we look at? We classify in three different ways. One are fake or junk news. These are false or hyperpartisan news domains. We started off with opensources.co, and we refined it to get about a list of about 700. We also looked at mainstream news outlets, which my colleague Greg Eady here created a list of about 115. We filtered all fake news articles out of here domains if they were mutually combined. And lastly, we looked at local news. And so these are state or city news outlets that also strive for best journalistic practices. This was scraped off the web from sites like Meredith and Sinclair. We looked at all the stations they had, and there's a few online directories too. And so this is also an open source resource. Please check it out. It's called Local News Dataset. And so we use these to classify the links shared. And so you might be surprised. Let's take a, who thinks that more than half of the articles might have been fake news? No one. Okay, this might be a bad place to poll. Okay, we got it. I'm just going to jump right into the numbers. So when we look at news sharing, surprisingly, only 6% of all hyperlinks the IRA shared were from fake or junk news. Although that's 50% more than our user group, we think that's a relatively low number of what we'd expect from the IRA. Mainstream media is about the same. It's about 11 to 12%. And most surprisingly, local news. 30% of all hyperlinks shared by the IRA are of local news outlets. That is 15 times more than comparison groups. This is, so we talked a lot about what this data looks like in aggregate and what the tweets look like. This is what the user interface looks like. So I went to the web archive, and this is an account called American Gunslinger. Take a moment and take it all in. What do you see? Liberty, America, guns. Wisconsin, truth, strength. Great. This is a tweet that they sent out of a local news article. Illegals held in vicious rape in Massachusetts. Coincidence? Mainstream media? This is the article it led to. This is a local paper. It's the Boston Herald. They have won awards. I grew up reading this. This story is true. The language is polarizing. The imagery is polarizing. Think about how the identity of who shares it helps frame this content, right? It supports a certain kind of narrative when an account called American Gunslinger shares this, right? So you can have very polarizing information that's true. So we use classifications from Patrick and Darren to split up the local news sharing to see what other accounts like USA Gunslinger said about local news outlets. So exactly as Kate said, there's a really clear difference between the IRA left, which are all black and progressive, and the right, which are white and Christian. But there are themes that are overlapped, and they are all about racial tensions. So in the left, there's a lot of local news outlets that support systematic racism and police brutality. On the right, fears about Black Lives Matter activists, Muslims, and immigrants are sound there. And indeed, when we look at the top words from tweets that share local news from both left and right, we see that police and shooting are among the top words. So we talked a little bit about the content being shared, but how was it shared, right? So how can we view the IRA as business, and how can we view it like as engineers, right? Like, how would you engineer this? And so to do that, we look at the user interface used to share tweets. This is called the client or a source. In the metadata, it's specifically called the source, and this is all data that we have. So these are 6 different user interfaces, the top 6 used to share local news. And so the first one is called Twitter Feed, and it is a defunct service that was created by Bitly, and what it does is allows you to follow RSS feeds on other websites and filter them for certain keywords. For example, you can follow the Boston Herald, and anytime there's anything about immigrants and rape, you can tweet it out to Twitter and it looks original. But there's more control than just sourcing. There is precision about how it's framed. You can cycle through different canned responses, such as time to build that wall or something like that, right? And you can also have even more precision about scheduling when it is sent. So you can send it during US work hours to appear as if it's coming from an American. You can also choose hashtags and similarly related hashtags to help build your audience. And you also have the ability, which is a premium feature on certain accounts, to target the top influencers of certain accounts and the top influencers of certain hashtags. So this is a way to latch on, and these are all marketing tools. They are free marketing tools. There's also TweetDeck, which is a social media dashboard. And it's actually, tools like this are quite common among people who use Twitter. I use something like this as well. You're able to create custom feeds. So in addition to your own personal feed of all the people you follow, you can create feeds for certain topics. This helps source content, right? So what we see is that for local news at least, the IRA use best practices from marketing exactly as they are intended to great success, but instead of selling a product and building a brand, they are using it for propaganda. And their brand is that they are a superpower of hackers, but they are just marketers. And indeed, when we look at engagement, what do we see? Your coolest friend gets more traction than most of these IRA accounts, right? These are the average likes and retweets and replies. Similar to what Kate said, like most IRA accounts don't get much traction, right? A lot of them are probably there to develop the methods. But the left and right did get traction. And indeed, when you look at, they have the highest average number of retweets and likes because they're able to penetrate retweet networks about Black Lives Matter and anti-Black Lives Matter discourse. And when we look at the aggregate data, it supports that. So I hope that I showed you at least a push that fake news isn't necessarily the problem. Real news can be used to great success when it is framed in a certain way. Also that the IRA employs marketing tactics and are not proof tactics. Thank you.
I'd like to invite all of our panelists back up here.
Once we get hacked right now.
Yeah.
Not the IRA. What is it called?
They're friends
We
with
challenge
hackers.
them.
They're friends with
All right.
They aren't hackers themselves.
So we're going to open this up to the audience for questions in a moment, but I want to start and take my prerogative as moderator to throw out what I think is a big picture question sort of running through all of these things. So I'd be interested in comments from anybody on the topic of this. So 2 big picture questions, and you can answer either of them. The first one is, and we've seen, and what's amazing about this is we've seen 2 different sort of ways of coming at analysis here. We've seen account level coming at analysis, we've seen topic, multiple ways, topic level ways of coming at analysis, and then coming at it through the hyperlinks as well. So with these different ideas on the board right now, I guess I have 2 big questions. The first is, from what you've seen, do you think that this looks more like a concerted overall strategy that was being taken place that was like directed top down? Now, this is, the sort of, data science analysis community meets the Russia community. One of the big things in the Russia community, one of the big debates has always been the all-powerful Putin, right? That we get this, and people in the Russianist community, I think, get somewhat annoyed sometimes with pundits and media, thinking Putin is the puppet master who's got his fingers on everything and can just make whatever he wants happen to happen. So the first question is, when you look at this, who knows regardless of whether Putin's involved with this, but does it look like it was centrally directed to you? Does this look like a coherent strategy, maybe within the box of finding things out in early years and then changing things? Or does this look like a bunch of people coming to work with different middle-level managers doing different things at different times? The second question is perhaps then follows from that, which is, does it look, from what you've seen, as if this idea here was more based in the sort of what was going on here, to the extent that there was a strategy going on here? Was this more based in the sort of story we've heard of just sort of sowing divisions in society, that this is to sort of ratchet up on the left and on the right and just inflame tensions? Or, as Kate was showing at the end there, you've got the left accounts and the right accounts, and the left accounts are saying one reason to be mad at Hillary, and the right accounts are saying another reason to be mad at Hillary. So based on all the time you've spent on this, do you get the sense that this was a campaign orchestrated at helping to get Donald Trump elected? Or was this a campaign orchestrated at just sort of riling up American polarization? So I open it up to anyone who wants to answer either of those questions or both.
Well, I think for the first one, about is this a coherent strategy versus is this a bunch of people coming into work? I think those 2 things are not mutually exclusive, right? So I think there's probably some overall direction, and is the overall direction the strategy of sowing discord or preferencing one candidate over the other? I think there's some element of that, but I think at the same time you have, here's an organization, here's your top level goal. How you get it done from the tactical level, I don't know. So then you see, at one point we're going to try these things, they don't work out. So then we switch over to this other thing, we try these things. Oh, this gets a lot of traction, let's push on this a good bit. I think it's probably a little bit of both here.
I would say, back up to the context I've been studying online conversations for a long time, crisis events. And we had cases over and over again where we were telling emergency responders that they needed to be able to respond to crisis events. And the problem was they were waiting for top-down orders, and they actually can't. You can't work while you're waiting for top-down orders because they would be too slow for the cycle. So in order to actually be good at social media, you have to enable the person operating the account to improvise. And so at the bottom level, you've got a lot of improvisation, and you can see that happening. And that improvisation, they're learning from that, they're getting better, they're evolving to something, they're copying each other. Are there other directions that are coming in? I think so. I think there's other directions like pushing this thing, push that thing, push the other thing, and the rest of the time just keep improvising, keep doing your thing, right? So I think it's a little bit of both, but it doesn't work unless the person operating the account has the ability to improvise. And when they got better at improvising was when they started to take off into having the effects they wanted.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. I mean, you can definitely see signs of, the night shift mucking around and having fun at certain points. When I'm not on camera, I'll tell you about the account Pee on Hillary. But it also gets more and more professional, I think, too, as it goes on, and it gets better and better and better as it goes on, including stuff I've seen that's happening right now. And you can see some orchestration beyond just the IRA, like the October 6th spike that Patrick happened. We don't know that they collaborated with the Podesta email dump, but it seems highly likely that they did.
Let me say a couple words about the second question. So we have, in some separate analysis we didn't get a chance to talk about today, dug into the tweets, a large sample of the tweets in the month before the election, and categorized them as being sort of attacking or supporting the left or the right, and dividing it up between the right trolls and left trolls. And we see big differences in the degree to which they're tweeting support for sort of their candidate. Like the accounts on the right are much more supportive of Trump than the accounts on the left, like demonstrably much more supportive of Trump than the accounts on the left are supportive of Hillary. They both attack the other side, but in terms of levels of support, there are big differences in the month before the election, suggesting some sort of bias in the application.
Yes. On the left, they don't even talk about Hillary as much, and when they do, it's very, very often negative.
Yeah, this is something that I found. So we were trying to struggle with this, right? Like, is it a push to elect a particular candidate or not? Looking at the kinds of articles that get like lots of traction. So the #1 shared YouTube video around this time was Trump About You. It's a music video featuring Donald Trump. So it's humorous and it got huge amounts of traction. But the articles that are being shared are, like I said, there's one mention of Hillary about her being ill, another one about her starting the birther movement. But most of the rest, like most of the popular articles at this time were not direct, like not about her at all. Like things about Bernie or things about like things attacking the right. So I feel like there's very little evidence about support for Hillary. But one of the issues that I ran into for this is, we know that the mainstream media covered Donald Trump a lot. So are we seeing a reflection of, well, this is what's popular, so we're going to reflect that and share a bunch of popular things? Or is it part of an underlying strategy? That's the thing that becomes really hard to sort of disentangle.
I think they definitely talked about Jill Stein more than the mainstream media did.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll come back to this topic. Oh, Kate, do you
Can
want
I
to say
say one thing about
Yeah.
for a particular candidate? Interestingly enough, if you look prior to June 2015, there aren't a lot of left-leaning accounts yet. Most of it's kind of right-leaning, and it's not yet Trump. It's Cruz. So early on, they were more just like kind of getting into the conservative, the grassroots conservative online activity. And it becomes more focused on Trump right June of 2015, which makes sense considering other things there.
But to the top-down point, when they go Trump, they go whole hog, and every
Something happened then when
Yeah.
top down, the whole thing changed right in June, around May, June 2015.
You definitely see regime changes. Just looking at it just goes from, again, we didn't have a lot of time, but you could show like fraction of the tweets that are retweets. They're like dramatic regime changes of that. And it feels odd that everyone would come to the sort of own independent conclusion that, yeah, we want to change this strategy. I mean, it's implausible to me. So it has to be some, at least at the, maybe not the tactics level, but at least at the strategic level, some sort of, I mean, I'm not saying that it's Putin, but somebody's telling these folks what to do. Come on.
So take combining these answers together. What's interesting about this is it sounds like there's a strategy, right? There may be a strategy to give people leeway, and there may be a strategy to try different things and stuff like that. But it sounds at some point there's a strategic decision that's made that it's going to be valuable to have these left-leaning accounts as well, to go after this left-leaning audience. And I think our initial discussion we got of this in the sort of punditry was was that what was going on here was a left and a right, and it was just about sowing discord. But it sounds like almost all of the groups are sort of leaning towards, anyone who does a kind of deep dive in this, is that that's not necessarily inconsistent with an attempt to get the Republican candidate elected, especially once that candidate becomes Trump, that it may be about getting a left audience out there that wouldn't have followed a bunch of right accounts. But it does lead to an interesting question, especially comparatively, you know, Kate, with some of the stuff you've done before with crisis stuff. Like this is kind of a sophisticated idea that you're going to get these, but both get roots in somewhere. I mean, and what the simplest thing we might have thought of is just try to flood the airwaves with lots of pro right-wing content. But there's actually, so it sounds like a more sophisticated strategy coming out. That, and maybe, one question is, was that to try to make it look like it was left and right, but that leads to a much larger question, which is like, when they were doing this, did they think that afterwards, at any time people would know who they were doing this, or was this all done with the intention that it was always just going to look like Americans? In which case, again, it comes back to why putting up this left-wing content. But that's my commentary. All right, so there's lots of people in the audience who'd like to say things, so I'm going to take, let's take a few questions, and then we'll do a round of answers, and then a few questions. So Susan?
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting panel and fascinating. I remember reading an article in the Times that talked about the tweets that were connected with Black Lives Matter, or hashtagging, that were not actually part of that movement. And their argument was that it was trying to suppress the African American vote. And does that make sense from what you're seeing? And I think that's especially interesting because I've been looking at the whole question of Russian critiques of democracy, and it's interesting because the very first one I found is actually the poet Alexander Pushkin, who is saying, well, democracy in America is particularly problematic because of slavery. I mean, a completely legitimate point. So it's interesting that this kind of, and then of course the Soviets also were talking a lot about how, the oppression of the black people in the United States showed that it was all a hypocrisy and a fraud. So I'm just kind of curious to hear more about what you think the targeting of the African American community was about, and what they hope to do, and part of any larger trends.
We'll go with things. Let's just answer questions like, yeah.
I would say in 2016 and 2015, I think 100%, their goal was, well, in 2016, their goal was to suppress the vote for Hillary. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the messaging that we were seeing in those communities. It was pretty consistent across the Black Lives Matter and African American or Black community, as they described their accounts. As in that group, that's what I would say it is. I think there is a long history of that being a community that has been targeted in different ways with Russian disinformation in the past, so I don't think that was different. Interestingly, if you look at some of the early proto-trolls, they already had signals, the rap hashtag and some of the things that they were doing, they already had signals that that was one of the areas that they were interested in infiltrating before I think they knew what their strategy was going to be. You do see some of the early conversation being very critical of Obama. Later, once he's not in office anymore, they begin to support him, but early on they do have some criticism of Obama. So I think just basically early on it's stoking sort of the anti-US government sentiment that is already there for good reason. You just kind of cultivate that, and I think that they were participating in that, and then they used that in 2016 to try to suppress the vote.
And to Cody's earlier point, that these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive goals to elect Trump and sow division. And Black Lives, if you want to sow division, Black Lives Matter was the issue of the day. I mean, it still is to a large degree, but you can see them continue to do that throughout the data set. And when the Kaepernick flag issue became an issue, they jump on top of it. So I think
and Kaepernick, and it actually says, he comes out in a statement that says we shouldn't vote for Hillary for whatever reason. He actually, a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement people were actually communicating that neither of these candidates are going to be good for us. So it wasn't just happening on Twitter, and it wasn't just Russian trolls. This is something that's getting, and who knows who's influencing whom, but it wasn't an isolated thing.
Denise?
Right. So, I'm going back to Josh's question of what's going on here. What kind of strategy can we discern from the data that you all observe? And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about Sergei Lukyanenko's, those of you who follow Russian cultural scene, he is the he's the author of that Day Watch, Night Watch. He has an early, very short piece that is called, I forgot the name of it, but it's something about terrible foe. And the setup there, it's a science fiction, sort of emulating Strugatsky brothers. The plot there is that there is a war and they're shooting at the invisible foe, and the enemy fires back. And at the end of the story, we see that it's actually a mirror. It reflects what they're shooting at in exactly the mirror fashion, right? So what I'm thinking about what's going on here, right? So you see those trolls embedded in two sides, right? And they're amplifying, so to speak, the fire, right? So would you be sort of interested in entertaining that thought as a strategy, sort of if there is a strategy, right? If there is a strategy, and sort of the reason why I'm thinking about that is that in all your presentations, when you looked at the timeline, there was this notion, but you didn't really articulate that, but it was there, that there is a reactionary sort of, there's something going on in the environment, and all those tweets and retweets are reacting, but at the same time, you were talking about some initiative, right? So, and the question is to all of you, if you were to pick the side, whether those trolls are proactive or reactionary, what would be your bet?
So I would say early on they tried to be proactive. So those hashtags like the Fukushima 2016 and the hashtag Coke Farms and all of these disasters that they invented that never actually happened, that was an attempt to be proactive, to like invent some conflict that didn't exist, and that was ineffectual. Like they didn't get retweets, they didn't get followers, those accounts got shut down. And so I think they gave up on that strategy and instead seized on to already existing systems. That's more effective anyway. So did they know all along that they were going to make that turn? There's some suggestion, like you said, they used like rap hashtags earlier, that they were going to come back to the sort of black-white schism in America from early on. Did they know they were going to do that? I don't know. But they certainly gave up this idea of like trying to invent things from whole cloth. It didn't work.
Go ahead.
I think that mirror analogy is quite good, especially when we talk about their use of local news, right? So they're taking true things that happened. It's sort of like there's a really unflattering light on your face, and then they show the mirror. It's like, this is happening in Massachusetts, like. And I think that it seems like it kind of pushes almost towards like a loss of faith in institutions like the police. And I think that's, mirrors, good analogy.
Yeah, Twitter, taking a step back just in what is Twitter or what is social media, it's generally a very reactive platform. So I think there has to be some sort of combination here. The organization exists for a reason. There was some goal or some set of strategic goals that they wanted. So in that sense, there's initiative. We have some long-term thing we want to execute. But to Kate's point, you have to give a lot of freedom to these people to be reactionary to like, this thing's really popular right now, let's jump on this. This thing's really popular right now, let's jump on that. Because that's the dynamic of the platform. That's how you get traction. I think that's Leon's point about using marketing tools to great effect is a really great example of that. Marketing tools are taking advantage of things that are already out there to build a better audience or to get more traction.
So I will say
I just want to give evidence to that point of reaction. We actually stumbled in, we talked about one study here, but we stumbled into this disinformation ecosystem from multiple different directions, but all through data sets that we had that were collecting data on crisis events in real time. From those data sets, we can recreate a large portion of this kind of data because they used actual crisis events that, the whole world goes online to talk about it, and so did the trolls. And so there was this sort of like, it was very reactionary, but that's because that's what Twitter is.
when you ask about the proactive nature of here, I mean, I was really surprised when we started discovering this local news bias here. And the best thing we could come up with was that this was designed to build trust in these accounts. That people, we went out and got data, and there's public opinion showing Americans trust local news sources much more than they trust national news sources. So we thought, okay, this is exactly what you're talking about. This is proactive, right? To go out there and I'm going to share a whole bunch of local news, and it's going to build up some trust in what we're doing. And when we want to get the messages out, we can get it out through local news. What's interesting, though, to me is that is the finding that we get from Darren and Patrick, that there are accounts that this is limited, that the accounts that were sharing the news just kept sharing the news, right? So I thought originally when this, you share a lot of local news, then you can put other things in there because you've built up this trustworthy. But combining a few of these things, it looks like from pulling across the lines here, that maybe what you're doing here is the kind of stuff Leon was showing. You're using local news because it's more trustworthy, but you're using it to share things that are not flattering. And I'm not sure if that's proactive or that's reactive, right? Because you're reacting to the fact that there's an incident you could share. It's proactive that you have this strategy for how you're going to go about doing it. Katie, do you want to?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm still thinking about the local news. I guess we don't know what they were for. In the case that they could have been for many different things. I do see some of the local news sites do get pulled into the clusters, which means that they show up, some that Oakland, St. Louis, they show up in my clustering, they'll show up in the Black Lives Matter group, and then there's other ones that show up in the right core. So they did maybe kind of eventually, kind of get pulled in that way because they're just sharing things that appeal.
Right, so that's what we thought originally.
And then there's sometimes when they do actually, a couple ones that are labeled news become politically partisan accounts. Like Missouri Online News or something else, is at least one that I've seen. So, but I also think they might have been there, so those hoax events and things, I think they might have been there that like if one had taken off, they could have used those sites to kind of push it. They had big followings. I think that they could have eventually used them for something else and possibly got distracted.
And at Columbia Chemicals, that was one of their earlier campaigns. They used fake local news websites, so it's not too much of a stretch to assume that they might use fake local news Twitter accounts too.
Although we don't actually see them do it. In these 38 accounts.
Right.
They don't push. Right. That's right.
I want to add one thing to the reactionary or proactive debate. And generally I agree with everybody that they were reactionary, but one thing they were very good at and are still good at is identifying issues very early. So just as one example that we dived in on was Christmas 2016, Christmas Day, Professor Drexler tweeted, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide." Some of you may remember that. Something like 20% of the Twitter content over the next week, and it started the day of the Russian trolls were responsible for on that story. Like they found that story early and they pushed it. And some accounts that Patrick and I were following before the 2018 election, right here in New York, Corner Store Caroline. Some of you may remember that case. It was in the New York Times, the Washington Post. A young black man hit a woman with his backpack.
That was like an 8-year-old. It wasn't a young man.
Yeah. Sorry, he was like, no, he's 9. He's 9. And that became a story. The trolls were responsible for, back of the envelope, something like 20% of the first day's content on that, and specifically doxing the person involved, their phone number. And very, very early, they find these little issues and try to blow them up. So it's reactionary because they're not creating it, but they're finding it and they're pushing it fast and early.
It's interesting because, it sounds like it sounds like you need a high level of expertise about American politics to be able to know what these issues are, but it also sounds like every time somebody goes and gives an example, it's about race. Right, and there is this, as people were saying before, this history over the Soviet period of focusing on racial problems in the United States. So it sounds like with a couple examples, these are people who really know what they're talking about in American politics, they know right exactly where the fault lines are, but it also sounds like race is always the thing that from the examples you're giving anyway, that race is like, all right, let's get some more comments from the audience, yeah.
Hey, my name is Michael Kamick. I work for the Behavioral Insights team here in New York, and working with policymakers on specifically this issue. I think you see lately in the political science literature from folks like Brendan Nyhan and Reifler and others that consumption of fake news in general is mostly concentrated among super consumers, and sharing of that fake news is mostly super sharers. From my viewpoint, I'm primarily concerned with the offline and online behavioral consequences of the types of information you're talking about here. I'm wondering, looking at Russian directed propaganda via these accounts as a subset of this sort of misinformation universe, I'd like to hear you reflect on what you think the online and offline behavioral consequences of this sort of content is, whether we know that, and how much literature is there, and anything else that sort of is relevant.
Was that directed at me?
No. Honestly,
I was like, that's a good
I mean, it's a really good question.
yeah. It's very interesting. We released one of these studies as well about the sharing of fake news on Facebook, and so we're talking a lot with reporters. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that when we think about this phenomenon of disinformation, right, there are actually 4 different questions, right, that get bundled together, and one of them is who produces it. So there's been a lot of discussion here about production aspects. Then there's the question of who is exposed to it, who shares it. We've seen some of that stuff here, although not too much on it. And then there's this final question of the so what, the consequences of it. And it's interesting because there are so many questions you could ask right now that all 5 of these people would jump up and answer immediately. But then this one is a sort of, I think this is we have learned a lot about those first 3 questions. We're just at the beginning of learning, of trying to figure out what the answer to that 4th question is that you're asking about. And one of the big questions is that people like Jason and Brendan, who do these very controlled lab experiments, or Adam Berinsky about this sort of corrections of misinformation, these sorts of things, how much this translates out into this larger context. So now that I've talked for a minute, have any of you guys thought of answers you want to give to the question Lana's talking? Yeah, Leon.
Let me think about this. So, I think the thing that I found most interesting with the IRA is that they're able to source information incredibly well, and they use marketing tools to automate that to some extent. And I think that if you have a certain worldview and a certain identity that you want to build upon, you can find information to agree with you, right? And so I think, and one of Alice Marwick has written about this, who shares fake news and why they share it. And a lot of it is to support your identity and your community identity. And that's more important than if it's true or not, or the source. And so, yeah, I think the internet just is like a Costco. You can find anything. You just have to know where to look for, and you can use tools to bring you what you need faster and get it to the right person to support that worldview. Especially if it's a hyper-partisan worldview, there's more incentive to do that.
Hi, I'm Ivan, Columbia Poli-Sci. My question is, just 2 questions. Have you seen anyone else try to do this before or currently? And what can be done to respond to this? Or what is being done to respond to this? I know the DoD has been working on this for a while. So,
When you say this,
Yeah,
you mean
to stop people from doing that, or either businesses or other governments.
well, just to stop organizations from trying to
snowballing tweets, trying to influence our system by using this system.
Yeah, I think this is one of the hardest questions because it's happening all the time. All sorts of different actors are participating. The IRA accounts that we see, we're integrating into existing sort of conservative grassroots. I say grassroots like that. They had the infrastructure. They weren't grassroots at all. They were like concerted efforts to increase the amount of conservative voices on Twitter. And we have examples of things happening in places all over the world. Similar kinds of we call it astroturfing or sock puppet accounts, but fake grassroots things happening for political influence are happening in all sorts of contexts. This is just one example. I think it becomes, it had this very geopolitical weight that people can focus on and say, oh, this is an attack from outside, and it's different. But if Twitter tried to stop all of the astroturfing that was happening, there would be little left of Twitter because it's happened. I think there's so much happening there that, that's not completely true, but I think that if you go online for an hour and look at things, you're going to encounter multiple campaigns.
There still be cat videos.
Cat videos, yeah, but they can be, I'm sure they're part of the,
Yeah, they're a tool. I've seen cat videos on
they're in there as well, yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna connect the previous question and this question a bit, and I want to preface this and say, this is not an answer about the impact this kind of thing had. I think it's really difficult to quantify impact, but I think it's not a question of whether there was impact. It's definitely an important topic, and it may have influenced things that we can't really know. That being said, the technology that exists can be used for any number of things. In terms of, has this been done before? Any sort of marketing campaign is doing this kind of thing. We have examples of astroturfing, as Kate said, from the 2008 campaign, the 2012 campaign, against any number of political people. And now the issue is what horrifies me about all of this is that the technology and the strategies and tools that have been used and shown to be effective can very easily be taken by domestic partners here in the United States. And we're seeing examples of that now. But how do you prevent that kind of thing from happening without taking away the platform is a very hard problem. In terms of the previous question about behavioral consequences of this, I think we see that now. So like astroturfing attacks from like 2008 and 2012 didn't really get much traction. People didn't really care. Most of it was humorous. A lot of it wasn't really, it didn't seem to have the same kind of impact on our ability to trust the information ecosystem. But now things are very different. It's like if you go to Reddit and you look at any sort of politically divisive conversation, very quickly it devolves into people throwing around accusations of being a Russian troll or a Russian shill. It used to be you're a shill of a company. So I'm promoting some product like Bitly and Leon. But now it's just so easy to say I don't have to believe anything you say because you could just as likely be a Russian troll. And I think that's really reduced our ability to trust the information around us. So much so that people now will just disconnect from the overall information ecosystem. Like, there's too much, I don't trust any of it, and who knows who to trust, so I'm just going to watch my local news because at least I know who that person is.
Thank you very much.
One thing real quick is involved regarding who's doing this. The one thing that I think we as Americans should care more about that we don't is there's a lot of evidence suggesting that most of the state actors engaged in this are doing it to their own people. I mean, you can see that in this data set. It's mostly Russian. Chinese do it like crazy. And I think we should care more about that, and that should be a larger conversation.
Yeah.
Mexico.
Yeah, Brazil.
Name an autocratic country, and they're doing this.
Hello, my name is Anders Lucy from political analyst from Europe, and I was wondering if, in the course of your research, you were able to connect with or compare your data with research on similar operations in European politics. And because we know that there were similar Russian disinformation operations in Europe, which were most of which were not as successful. I know success is very hard to quantify, but perhaps we're not as successful as the American one. And if yes, do you think that there is something in the United States that makes the country of society more vulnerable to this sort of attacks than Europe, or was it just for the lack of trying the lack of effort from the Russian part?
I mean, I haven't answered to that, but if you want to. Well, one quick thing about like how can we learn from like this campaign and see if it is in other places is that in the metadata, at least for automated marketing tools and like custom apps, there's a field that specifies where it came from, like the user interface is talking about. And Deliberate, which was used by the IRA, was also used in Syrian campaigns from the same week. And so, like, I like to think about this as like an engineer, a social engineer, right? Like, to achieve something, there's like an optimal way of doing it, and people will mirror that optimal way. And if it's a free marketing tool, they will use it. Also, like if people use apps, that is stored there too. Every app needs a unique name, and so when you look at the source in the metadata, it's there. If you look on your mobile phone in a tweet, usually it says like, Leon tweeted this using his iPhone. That is the source metadata, and it's available. So if you care about like the infrastructure used in automating using apps or marketing tools, it's there. In terms of the European context, yeah, how much literature there is on this is an interesting question. I don't know of much, but certainly there's research interest in the impact that these kind of strategies had on the Brexit referendum, on the French and German national elections. You know, so Macron's campaign, there was a very far right French candidate who had a lot of support by Russian organizations or by like Russian money. There are other issues. So like in Greece and Macedonia, was trying to join NATO, but there was a big issue about naming. This was amplified by external intelligence agencies. So like from like an international stage, yeah, this is clearly happening in other places besides the United States. I don't think it's an interesting question about is the United States more susceptible? I think in some ways, yeah, because we don't really trust the government anyway. As like a national zeitgeist, the United States was founded on this idea of, no, we'll throw away government and create something different. Whereas like in the UK, you have the BBC, a state-funded, well-trusted media organization that lots of people get news from. Could such an entity exist in the United States without people immediately claiming that this is biased in some huge
Disagree.
way?
I almost think it's the opposite of why we're more vulnerable. I think that we're almost too trusting of our information environments, because if you look at, we've talked to folks from like the former Soviet countries, and I had my first paper out in space, and the former president of Estonia contacts me by Twitter, and he's like, "Oh, welcome to the club. Now you know what it is to experience these things," because they've experienced these things for a long time, and so they're more, I don't know if it makes for a better society, but they become more skeptical of the information that they see. And I think we were particularly vulnerable as we hadn't experienced this at this level before.
Right.
So trust can go both ways. And at the same time, we have a diminished trust in institutions over time over the last several decades for various reasons. And so I think those two things hit an interest in. We're trusting, but we don't trust our media, and so we trusted each other. We trusted local media, and we weren't expecting it, whereas other people might have been expecting it.
It's interesting following up on that. So when we released this paper about who shared fake news on Facebook a few weeks ago, one of the findings was that people who were over the age of 65 on average shared more fake news on Facebook, especially than younger people. And this is exactly one of the, we didn't actually have this in the paper. We had a bunch of other speculative explanations, but in the discussion that took place afterwards when we were talking to reporters and some discussion of it on Reddit, this exact issue got raised that maybe this was a generation that grew up, this was the generation that trusted Walter Cronkite, and so they were taken aback by the idea that something that looked like news could not be news. But we're getting a little bit far afield. Yeah, Darren?
I want to just one thing. My favorite tweet in the entire second favorite tweet in this entire data set is a retweet of a Swede who is in charge of Sweden's version of the FBI, and he tweeted out in Swedish a warning to the people of Sweden that, hey, in early 2017, hey, look at what's happening in the United States with Russian disinformation. You need to know that this could happen here too. Was retweeted by South Lone Star, I believe it was, but it was a very right-wing account, one of the Russian IRA accounts, like retweeted, even though it was in Swedish. This random right-wing Russian account retweeted it to his American audience in Texas because they're paying attention.
Corey?
So looking to the future, should we expect more presence of trolls across platforms? So there might be two reasons why. The first being that there are better marketing tools out there for YouTube. And the second is that there's more attention on Twitter, so trolls might want to go to places like YouTube or to Tumblr a little bit more. What do you think?
That's a really good question. And in fact, like a lot of these marketing tools interface with multiple platforms and allow you to control multiple accounts. And so we are able to get this data set and this metadata field in Twitter. We're not able to get that on Facebook or any of the other platforms that it interfaces with. So I think the answer is very possible. It's a flip of a switch.
Can I correct something that I think happens in research in a couple of different dimensions about, and I think when we give the talk, we might create the impression that this is happening on Twitter and not elsewhere. That's because we have the Twitter data. I think this is a mistake that other people are making about, oh, it's happening on social media, not elsewhere. No, it's happening all across the media sphere, and we have traces of it on social media, so we can study it in ways we haven't been able to study it before. And those traces are specifically right now on Twitter, so we have a lot of focus on Twitter. But the IRA operations were cross-platform. When you go back and study it through the Wayback Machine or other methods, you actually find traces of the same account will be, For My Squad has like, a Facebook page, a Tumblr, you've got Instagram, website, SoundCloud. My student was listening through their the podcast. So they're actually cross-platform, and so I expect the cross-platform to keep going. I expect it to continue unless the platforms figure out how to somehow limit it.
Yes.
I'm curious to what extent the troll accounts went and tried to build up trust, meaning, were these just accounts that were focused on retweeting and liking and creating this impression that people are talking about something, or was it something where, like you mentioned, there was a complex personality that was built up by these separate accounts where people began trusting and interacting with them and actually thinking these were these real personalities?
It depends on the account. You could see, like, once an account got a certain number of followers, you really see a lot more energy going into an account. And I mean, my sense is, once I need to look at this further, but my sense is once an account gets to a certain size, they would give it some of their better English speakers and more attention and more direct interactions with other real Americans.
Yeah, they had soldier accounts that kind of just tweet, retweet others. And then, when they started to get attention, they would have sort of elite accounts. And those elite accounts, I think, are the ones that ended up in the way I did the social networking. They ended up in the core of that social networking, and there's probably just a handful of them on each side. I would say probably 20 on each side that were the elite accounts. And they did a couple of things. One of the things they did is they did a lot of mentioning, and they did a lot of targeting of specific people. Hey, Sean King, pay attention to me. D-Ray, here I am. And trying to get those relationships, whether it's a following relationship or a retweet or just an interaction with other elites, partisan elites on Twitter. And so, I see like a lot of like cultivation of what would then look like authentic connections to other people or other accounts, in the online sphere.
Okay, Alex?
So this was just phenomenal. Thanks again to all of you. I mean, so much food for thought. I want to actually flip this and give you a very unfair international relations question about what is actually a very live issue now. And those in the sort of track 2, track 1.5 community want to maintain kind of open lines and dialogues and engagements and figure out rule sets of conduct with the Russian Federation are facing this issue. And this is coming up increases in these working groups and so
Alex, do you want to explain what track 2 means?
Yeah, so track 2, like, one level below sort of official diplomacy, right? And what, in these sort of, expert or policymaker research sort of networks, how to sort of, arrange an architecture of sort of engagement and so forth. I think our Russian colleagues are, in general, really concerned with rule sets of international conduct. Right? This is a lot of Russian dissatisfaction stems from the U.S. dominating rules and world order, global governance, and so forth. But the point is, one of the memes I'm hearing increasingly is that we should make distinctions between social media, which we can't control, and hacking. That red line for future conducts should be at hacking. And the social media is something we can't control, and we can't police, and we can't verify, and frankly, we should just give up on it. This set of presentations, I think, really, forces a serious rethink about that. But I was wondering how you react to that. How, like, going forward, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but in 2-3 years' time, if their relations are better and so forth, and there's norms again about how we interact with each other, whether that's the place in which the line A should be drawn, but B could be enforced, the sort of hacking versus sort of social media operations. And if that's the case, then that goes both ways. Right?
So I don't think we want to lump all of social media together. So for instance, one of the things that sort of these guys famously did was set up competing protests at the same place at the same time,
Yep.
with the left guys and the right guys at the same place. That feels a lot closer to home than sort of fighting on the internet. I mean, that's a chance to get somebody hurt. I mean, like, that's the goal.
Right.
It's not,
When it crosses from online off.
yeah.
Yeah, because that could be fun.
Yeah, it's
Go
go.
ahead, yeah, you go first.
So, to be fair, my background prior to getting my doctorate was in cybersecurity. And I think the question here, like, if the question here is should online information operations on social media platforms be treated with the same level of severity as computer penetration, I think there's definitely the question about weighing risk in terms of bodily harm. Certainly, using information operations on social media can result in bodily harm. In the same way that I can, if I turn off the electrical grid to the city of New York, what'll happen? I think there's different levels of response there, though. The main issue I would bring up is there's a balance between how much security you're willing to provide to a platform or some technology and how much impact you're going to have on the civil rights of the people who use that platform. As I'm building security appliances, I can build a computer that is more secure and have marginal impact on the level of privacy and security that you, the user, have. One of the issues we see with this is if I want to know every single thing that a particular or possible Russian troll has posted, that means I, as a platform, have to collect everything and store everything that all people on the platform are saying. And I'm not sure I'm willing to give up as a user that level of privacy. Because like we see in the data that we have, Twitter doesn't even have all of the data from the trolls that they have released. We actually have some tweets that they don't have because before we knew these people were trolls, they deleted their content, and Twitter didn't keep that. Now, certainly that has impact on the security of the platform and how much more security we can add to the platform. But I think that to me would be the argument against saying social media, like online information and operations in social media, is the same as hacking. Because there's a different level of impact on my personal civil liberties that would need to be affected to provide security on social media in this way.
I guess there's a difference between saying we can police it versus saying when we find it, that's over the line.
Right.
A lot of times I think we're in conversation about what can the platforms do. We spend a lot of time, and we were in this similar field, I know coding pretty well. We realized we had lunch together, dinner together 6 times over the last 2 years, which is more than almost anyone that I know. But we also often talk about what can the platforms do, and thinking about the geopolitical ramifications and what policy should be like. Even when we say policy, we usually think about what should policy be towards the platforms. And so thinking out of that paradigm to be what should, where are the lines for people making diplomatic choices? And there's something about this campaign, and I don't know if it's going to answer your question, there's something about this campaign which is elegant in its rhetorical, it's got this rhetorical power to be able to say very clearly, they were not advocating for something they believed in. They were actually saying opposite sides of things, just to foment anger and to have to spread these other kinds of narratives. And there's something different about that than other kinds of propaganda that's promoting some kind of worldview that people care about. Now there's other, that's hard to draw the line sometimes and decide. But there is something about that is it's ugly in a way that I think many people could say it's ugly when they reflect on it. But I don't know how would you say, this kind of inauthentic, pushing it. It's one thing to push for something you care about or your candidate. It's something very different to just try to break things apart, which is what it seemed to be trying to do. And I don't know how to.
I mean, but that comes back to the beginning of the discussion where I'm still not. I mean, I know that there were incidents when they tried to do this, but I'm still not sure that this wasn't within an overall structure that was to push for a particular candidate and people freelanced on things and got creative.
Yeah, that their goal is that, but it's one thing to say, I believe in this, I'm going to advocate for this, and it's something different to say, I want that, so I'm going to do this other thing, to say things that I don't believe in to try to get there.
I mean, but the other thing is it's very hard to have campaign finance rules that says foreign governments cannot spend money you know, to have an ad in an election, but then to turn around and say, well, in these high-level negotiations, you know what, you can't spend money on our ads, but if you want to spend money, you know, doing this kind of stuff, it's okay. But I think it's actually even slightly more complicated, because there is a way you can think of this from the international relations perspective, where you bundle cybersecurity and the interference in the elections together, and then you say, like, where do we draw this line? This is a box. But when I have been talking to various people about the threats, you know, posed by what happened in 2016 and this kind of thing, the other way to bundle it is you bundle it around domestic politics, right? And what happens is that you have multiple actors who are trying to influence domestic politics, and some of those actors happen to be foreign actors. And my concern has been, or concern is one way of, my concern is that the foreign interference using the toolbook that the Russians discovered in this particular election has become a red herring, and particularly for the platforms, because of the political connotations. It's very easy to say, all right, we're going to go off after foreign interference, which technically is illegal if you're spending foreign money to try to influence the outcome of an election, right? And that when, you know, I was getting interviewed after the 2016 about the Mexican elections, and the question was, well, do you think the Russians are going to try and interfere in the Mexican elections? And I said, I don't know if the Russians are going to try to interfere in the Mexican election. I'm not sure exactly what the Russians care about the outcome of the Mexican elections, but you know who cares about the outcome of the Mexican election is Mexicans, right? And so I think the long run legacy of this may be less on the foreign interference side, which is what, you know, we were talking about before, and more on a toolbox and a toolkit that now is going to have all these domestic actors. And when you're Facebook, it's really easy to say, we are going to kick a person off the platform who's spewing nonsense, who claims to be a Navy SEAL from Tennessee, but is actually sitting in St. Petersburg, and we figured that out, and they violated our terms of service. But what about when that person spewing the same thing actually is a Navy SEAL in Tennessee? Yeah. Going back to the downstream question, the downstream effect is the same, that people are being exposed to information that might be blatantly false, that might be hateful and all these other things, but the political implications of how you deal with it are differently. So I think it's an even more complicated question, because I don't think we can just neatly bundle this as an IR set of issues.
I think that gets into like my queasiness about this, is because I mean, it is the case that I have not considered this, like the difference between how do we respond versus how does the technological platform do this. I think it's a really important question to ask. Just the difficulty I see with that is it's so hard to unequivocally say this is what's going on, especially without the technology of the platform. So, you know, how can we say that on the one hand it's illegal for the Russians to do this? If we identify it, we're going to have some sort of like significant response, because we know that that's what the federal government has done in response to potential attacks on the electoral infrastructure. We know that they had a response to that. But then, yeah, if the strategy is that the Russians wanted to get Donald Trump elected, that is the same strategy that any major Republican who supported Donald Trump in the United States also wanted to further. So if they were to take some money, huge amounts of money that they had and did this domestically, using the exact same tools, which I think is we're going to start seeing way more of, then yeah, that's the important thing. How do we stop it versus the response? But certainly there is a lot of discussion to be had about how we should respond.
Okay, so we've got just over 5 minutes, and I think it's a sign of how interesting our panelists are, how interesting the discussion is, that we're almost 2 hours in, almost 7 o'clock, and everyone's still sitting here. So but I think we're going to have to let these guys go at some point. So what I want to do right now is ask you guys not to answer questions. There's about 5 or 6 hands up. If you can be brief, I'll try to take all of the questions, and then we'll give each of our panelists a kind of final word to wrap it up. So we'll go cross the room. 1, 2, 3, 4. Was anyone else? Okay. All right. Okay.
I have a question about skilled original content creation, its sharing within these communities, and perhaps its generation by these communities. The process on this is, I work with Leon at Data Society on looking at how information is shared amongst conspiracy theories and extremist groups, and YouTube videos are used as authoritative sources for these communities. Did you find similar content being shared like that?
Don't answer. Yeah.
Is there a role for education in somehow helping people learn to identify trolls and all these other?
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about Jill Stein, because she came up a little bit, and I remember seeing a photograph where she was at the same table as Putin, and I haven't really heard much discussion about it. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I wonder if these accounts which targeted US elections ever tweet or retweet about international politics, US foreign policy, Syria, Iraq, any other geopolitical crisis elsewhere in the world, or did they intentionally refrain from getting into foreign policy issues?
How about affirmation bias? We know that Donald Trump was elected, but it was a close election. You know, are we reading too much into this?
Well, that's a great question when we have a minute left. Yeah.
Would more verified accounts on the platform reduce this, or would increasing, what practical tools or things can these platforms do to reduce things like this from happening in the future?
Okay, all right, so we've got a lot on the table. We've got 5 minutes left, so a minute per panelist to respond to anything that's just been said now, or else just wrap up. Let's go in we'll go with, I guess, in the same order we went originally. So Cody?
If we go first. Okay. So in terms of YouTube, yes, we know. So we see that YouTube is a very commonly shared source by these trolls. I don't think that's a strategy that's unique to them. Some of the other research I've done, people just trust media, multimedia, more than they trust text. Kate has great stories about the same picture of a shark that's swimming through a highway. After every single hurricane that you can imagine, it's always there. People, and like here in New York, there's like shark in the stock exchange. Multimedia is just way more trusted. In terms of education, and there was education, there was questions about foreign politics. Yeah, so certainly the trolls share a whole bunch of things about all kinds of international relations things. In terms of verified accounts and being taught about trust verified accounts, or what can you be taught, I don't know if there is a good answer to that. The verified account question goes back to a privacy thing. Should everybody be verified? There's real value in anonymity if you're a whistleblower, if you're in international situations. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for the education thing, though. I think that's a really hard but very hugely important question.
Kate?
All right, so I think I'm going to speak to, I'll speak to the education one first. One of the missions right now from our lab it's actually kind of spearheaded by my student Emmer, who actually led the Black Lives Matter, the second, and kind of led both of them. He's the PhD student in charge of the first study as well. We're really thinking about how do we communicate this we're academics, right? And we write papers and we get publications and whatever, but how do we communicate this in different ways to different audiences to help people understand how we're targeted, how we're vulnerable, and we're working on that. Different kinds of he gives a wonderful presentation if anyone wants the presentation. He gives a wonderful presentation on the Black Lives Matter conversations. I've been out to elder living facilities and libraries and other things, but we just don't have the capacity to go everywhere. And so how do we communicate this in different ways, I think is really important. But the problem is we don't know if that education is going to help. We don't know if that's actually going to contribute to diminished trust in information systems, which would actually backfire on us. If we are going to communicate it, how do we communicate it? So I think that is a really good question and something we all care about. And I'll just cede the floor and save my comments for other.
Patrick?
Me? I'm going to talk about the international thing. So there are accounts that specialize in international news and international content, even in the English language, although they do appear to be focused on a U.S. audience. I would say Syria Today looks like it's focused on the U.S., even though it's tweeting about Syria.
In fact, it was retweeting the official Syrian news agency.
Okay. Yeah. The English language news agency.
Yeah.
And so these accounts, they do specialize though. If I'm pretending to be like a grandma in Tennessee, I'm not going to have like very strong opinions on some detail of international politics. They sort of try to stick to their themes, I would say. And so they are, but they're specialized. That's my big picture.
The only thing I would end on, what I try to always end on, is that if you look at that data set, in English, there's more tweets in the year following the election than in the year before the election. And that's in a data set of accounts that have been found and shut off. So one would think that the number would go down, if anything. But no, it goes up because they're putting more resources and more energy into this with each passing year.
Yeah.
I really don't know how much more I could possibly add to this, but I will just say that I think that this campaign got a lot of bang for their buck. We are top-notch researchers, if I don't say so myself. We are spending a lot of time on these problems. They were able to sow distrust in US systems, and now they're able to sow distrust in US companies. So all these social media platforms are American companies. And if you want to attack America, what percentage of the GDP comes from these tech companies, right? So if they crumble, America's economy will surely take a big hit.
For less than the cost of one US fighter plane. Far less.
I'll offer a couple closing comments on this, just following up on what Kate said. I was in a discussion with a lot of people who had released these fake newspapers that you were referring to this weekend. And this education thing is really kind of an interesting question. Because one thing that comes out of our study was that, you know, the easiest place to educate people is in high schools. And so there has been a reaction, I think, to a lot of this to teach digital literacy to high school students. And my kids have come home with digital literacy stuff from school, and I think that's fantastic, and we should be teaching digital literacy in high schools. But the education question, obviously, if we're going to have an impact in the short to medium term, can't just be focused at 16-year-olds and 15-year-olds, right? It has to be a larger thing. But, and here's the crucial question. Jonathan Nagler, who's in the room right here, and I wrote an op-ed along with Andy Guest, we did this fake newspaper. And one of the points we made after we released the paper, we got asked to write this op-ed for the Philly Inquirer, and we wrote this piece saying, look, there's a danger from fake news, from disinformation, from any of the stuff we're talking about here, to democratic societies, because democracy, the normative justification for democracy, is based on people having access to information and using that information to make informed choices. And so if you put false information injected into the democratic system, it hurts the quality of the decision making people are making if they're getting false information instead of true information. However, right, so that's danger, that's not good for democracies. However, if it's small levels of disinformation as a percentage of the amount of true information about it, which is what these series of studies are finding, notwithstanding a lot of the gloom and doom we've been talking about here, if it's small levels of information, there's a larger danger. And the larger danger is if the prevalence of some fake information gives actors license to start calling anything they disagree with fake news, right, or disinformation, and people stop trusting in general. And I think this comes back to the education question, because I think half of our gut instinct is we want to run out there and educate people about this and try to teach them. But then the thing is, as Cody was saying before, well, if we teach people that there are Russian trolls out there, then as soon as you disagree with someone on the internet, are they a Russian troll? And when we wrote in the context of fake news, it's not good for democracies if there's more fake information out there, but it's a total unmitigated failure and disaster for democracies if people stop trusting real news and nobody has any connotation of that. So I think this is why this is such a difficult question, and I think it's why we're expending so much effort on trying to figure out what's happening in these areas, but I think it's going to remain challenging. So anyway, I'm sure we could talk for another 2 hours, but I want to just, if you would take me right now and join me in thanking our panelists for coming for a fascinating